What's up, everyone? It's Adar coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So our first tweet is from Reed Weissman, who was one of the astronauts, one of the 4 on the Artemis II mission that went around the moon and did a bunch of photography and really cool like iPhone photography, as you can see here. So he actually captured this video of the Earth setting behind the moon. So you can see here, it's like, and if you watch the sun on the Earth as well, like when the sun is setting, it actually moves like quite quickly, like pretty much similar to this. The Artemis crew were the furthest humans ever from Earth. I think it was about 400,000 miles when I saw, only a few thousand more miles further than Apollo 13, I believe, or Columbia, but still nonetheless like crazy footage that they're capturing here and awesome like pictures that they've gotten. And people are saying like Apple's gonna have to do a marketing campaign showing the iPhone, like shot with iPhone. And there's a bunch of crazy pictures too of like the other side of the moon when they're coming in, but nonetheless, this is just like a crazy time to be alive, and I thought it'd be interesting to share this, even though it's not necessarily like engineering related. Okay, next we just have some drama with Max, who works at Notion. I don't know what his role is. He doesn't say in his bio, but there's a vulnerability, quote unquote. It's still like kind of being debated in this tweet, even if it's a vulnerability, but every public Notion page is able to leak the email addresses of everyone who's edited it. As you can see here, 0 authentication, no cookies, no tokens, 1 post request returns full name, emails, and profile photos for every editor on the page. And also, like in this tweet that Impulsive made, he was saying like this was reported 4 years ago and they still haven't fixed it. But Max came and he works at Notion and he said, first, this is documented and we also warn users when they publish a page, but that's not good enough. We don't like this and are looking at ways to fix this by either removing the PII, which is personal identifiable information, from the public endpoints, or by replacing it with an email proxy similar to GitHub's equivalent functionality for public commits, which is what I use. Like I have like a specific email that when I do commits, because every GitHub commit is tied to an email, but GitHub will give you like an email that goes through them, which just has like your username plus a bunch of numbers instead of your real email. So that's pretty interesting. But then we have this reply from David Kramer, who is the CTO of Sentry, and he's like, what value is there in exposing the emails, whether anonymized or not? Not sure why you need email proxies here versus pruning from the endpoint. We have a similar component in Sentry and we just prune the API response to a special shape. And what's interesting about this too is like I kind of had to realize this like in kind of even the pre-AI days when I was like learning how to build APIs myself. And this might be interesting for the new people who are building APIs, because like when you're doing a tutorial learning how to code, they're always like, okay, well, you build a user entity, right? Or you build a specific entity, which is like kind of what they're doing here. Like they have like the edits entity or like the page entity with editors, and then you just like return that entity, right? So it's like very simple that you can just like fetch it from the database and return it. But then you eventually realize like, wait, I don't want to fetch the user and return their hashed password, you know, even though it's hashed, it's still like insecure to return hashes on passwords, and it's considered like breach if someone's able to get that information. So eventually, basically, you have to intuitively learn, and maybe AI will just do it for you now. But the idea that like the response itself is its own entity, you know, so there's like the user itself, but then there's like the user endpoint API response, which is its own shape, and if you're using TypeScript, like its own interface. So something interesting, and you know, kind of weird that Notion is like being like taking forever to do this, but Notion's not necessarily known to like be super quick with engineering. Like there's a bunch of other problems that people have reported over time, and I'm not a user, so I can't really speak to like how much they've been fixing things that people have reported, but still pretty interesting, and I wanted to make that API point as well. Okay, next we have a tweet from Brendan, who works at OpenCode, and they're talking about how they're moving OpenCode desktop to Electron from Tauri. So Tauri is a Rust-based kind of version of Electron, which I've actually used for my Pro Timer repo, which is on my GitHub, and it's basically just like a time tracker for contract engineers, and I just kind of publicly archived it, so I'm not working on it anymore, but it was fully written by AI and is like in Rust, because Tauri is like kind of Rust based, whereas Electron is Node.js based. But the purpose of both of them is like deploying desktop apps. So they're working on like their OpenCode desktop app, which I don't understand why people like these so much. I actually kind of like the TUIs, but especially because like none of these apps actually even like give you a file viewer, which I think is the most important piece, which I think is why like Cursor is still so great. But I don't really get to use it because I don't really use Codex with it, but I should consider moving, honestly, because the file viewer is like the most important piece, but like Codex, Claude, and OpenCode, I believe as well, like they have these desktop apps, but they don't even show you the files. You know, it's just like a chat in a desktop app as opposed to a chat in a terminal. Kind of stupid, but basically he goes through all the reasons why they're switching over. So one of them is that they use TypeScript for everything, so they want to use TypeScript as well for their Electron piece. And he did say that they want to rewrite the server side of OpenCode in Rust, so that would be interesting, but they're not doing it anytime soon, so they want to keep everything TypeScript, which makes sense, especially from a hiring perspective. I don't know how much it matters in the age of AI compared to like previously, but it still makes a lot of sense to like use these one languages, especially because you can like share packages and you can like reuse a lot of logic, especially if it's a monorepo. So, and then another reason is that Tauri uses WebKit on Mac OS and Linux, which has worse performance, I guess, than Chromium for their app specifically, but has minor inconsistencies, especially around styles. This is like the same issue, like when you're building a website, you always have to test it on Safari, because Chrome basically has a lot of like default CSS handlers that like if you're missing things that you like specifically don't put, like a big one is like position relative. That's like a big piece that like Chromium will do for you out of the box, but Safari won't have it. So like sometimes you'll look at your website on Safari, which is like even the Chrome app on iOS is a Safari wrapper or WebKit wrapper. It'll like have those style inconsistencies. So that makes a lot of sense that they ran into that. And it's just like a very common problem with web development is that like you always have to test it on your iPhone because it's going to be using WebKit under the hood, even if you're using the Chrome like iOS app. They said it was pretty easy to migrate over because they're just using agents and like they had a plan, which is cool. You know, like if you're into spec kit development, it seems like they did a Electron migration plan step by step and they used like this plans feature. So that's pretty cool. And they basically say that eventually like they have both versions still running side by side, but they're going to switch over to the Electron version like very soon. And then there's just like a quick QA at the bottom where he's like, Tauri uses Rust, doesn't that mean it's fast? And he says the piece that I mentioned earlier, which is like they said they would be down to rewrite it in Rust, but they're not going to do it anytime soon. He doesn't think Tauri's bad and he is a Rust developer, and Electron produces larger app bundles, but they think the trade-off is worth the switch. Okay, next we have a big announcement from Vercel, which is that they seem to have been compromised internally, and they basically have announced that there has been like a data breach. We don't know how much data has been leaked or infiltrated, and they're still like keeping tabs on it, but they have said that they've reached out to customers who have been impacted. So if you haven't been reached out to, theoretically you haven't been impacted is what it seems like, but they're still doing the investigation as it just happened today. When this first came out, people were giving them a lot of flack because like they basically just said like review in your environment variables. They didn't say like if you had to rotate or what was actually compromised, but throughout the day they were updating that, and they do say now that you should renew your environment variables. So if you do have server-side environment variables that are not under the like sensitive tag on Vercel, they kind of recommend that you should rotate it, which is pretty unfortunate because that has a lot of chance of impacting people. Like Postbridge from Jack Fricks has been like down. I don't even know if it's up, but it's been like down all day because of some Supabase infra error from him trying to rotate his key. So that's just super unfortunate. I don't know exactly what happened there. Like it would be interesting to see a postmortem from him. But essentially what happened apparently is that a Vercel employee got compromised via the breach of an AI platform from Context AI, and they're still investigating it through a series of maneuvers that escalated from our colleagues' compromised Vercel Google Workspace account. The attacker got further access to Vercel environments, and then they say like environment variables are fully encrypted at rest, obviously, but like every single, like all data pretty much these days is encrypted at rest using like AES 256 or whatever. And then yeah, he just says like follow the security bulletin, which is, you know, follow best practices of security response, secret rotation, monitoring access to your Vercel environments and link services, and ensuring the proper use of sensitive environment variables feature. And they're just updating their UI. They're working with elite cybersecurity firms, industry peers, and law enforcement. They've reached out to Context and understanding the full scale of the incident. And there's been other tweets too you could look into if you're interested to see like if you might have been impacted by the specific Google vector that they got attacked by. Someone had like the app. It's under like OAuth approvals, I believe, that you could find it for your workspace. And also there's like a setting in your workspace that you can turn on to only allow like specific sign-in with Google's to like get your name and email and like nothing else. So pretty scary, you know, and interesting. Personally for me, like most of my Vercel apps are just like web clients. So all of the environment variables in them are public variables anyway. So you would be able to get them just by going to the website. But if you do use Vercel full stack, then you definitely want to check to make sure like your striped keys and your database keys, etc., have not been compromised, and maybe just do like a preemptive rotation. And, you know, it is like kind of scary because like some of these platforms, like people have worked to make these better, but some of these platforms don't support like having multiple keys at once. So once you rotate it, the old key's dead and your system is basically dead at the same time. But if you use a product like Stripe, for example, you can like create a new key without killing the old key. So you create the new key, then you flip it over, and then you can kill the old key, so you don't have any downtime. But depends on the platforms you're using and the keys that you're using as well. And people are also saying like OIDC, which is a specific type of authentication that uses like JWTs that expire like every hour. It's kind of the future. Like we shouldn't even be using API keys in this day and age. But that gets back to like a whole bunch of issues where like when OAuth expires or those kind of pieces, like the JWTs expire, like sometimes the refreshes don't work or the refresh tokens might need expirations themselves, and then you have to reconnect, and it's really annoying. So API keys are a lot more convenient, but they do have like these inherent risks of like if someone gets access to it, they have access to everything. And that's where it's also like if you have scoped API keys, that's better as well. But then, you know, your service is only as limited to the scope that it has access to perform these operations on these third-party services. And then lastly too, people are talking about how in the age of AI that like security is going to become more compromised, and, you know, even Mythos and the Claude stuff, and how cal.com is not available open source anymore because they're afraid of security stuff. But in my opinion, like, yes, we're going to have more breaches and all of these things, but also security is going to get so much better. Usually I think the good guys do tend out to win, and we figure out like these mathematical constructs like hashing that just are unbeatable by current computing. And then you can get into quantum computing and all that, but I'm not super worried about that at this specific time, even though Google did have their paper that we covered. Very interesting. And, you know, technology is only going to progress forward from things like this. And Vercel is a very good squad to have like be breached, because they're going to figure out a bunch of things, and I'm sure develop a lot of new principles and solutions that we can take out to our own companies and future startups. Okay, next we have a really interesting vulnerability report from this guy TM CTMT, which is how he was able to basically spy on Discord's media proxy, which he was basically able to get access to like all of the media links that were being sent through Discord's media server, which is like media.discordapp.net. And if you use Discord, you're very familiar with that URL because you can like right click copy link, and like none of the images or assets are signed, right? They're just available through the URL, and they just kind of assume that since messages are private, that these attachments will stay private. But basically, there's this HTTP desync vulnerability essentially in HTTP 1.1, which I just learned about from this blog post, which is super interesting and basically takes advantage of like discrepancies between like client side content length parsing and server side content length parsing and like encoding as well. So you can basically trick the HTTP server into thinking that one of your requests is longer than it is, and so it'll actually just like attach the response from a future request onto your request, or maybe even the payload as well. I'm not sure exactly how that happens, but basically, if you read through the blog, you can see that he built a script that basically would create a request that had a content length longer than the actual payload that he was sending through to the Discord media server, and then he would get back these attachment URLs that were real attachments sent by users and DMs and private servers, so it didn't matter like what the publicity of the attachments themselves was, and it was crazy. And basically, he figured it out in 2022, and then it got patched, and then they gave him a bounty of $3,500, which people argue is not enough, which I agree. And it's just so interesting. I wonder if this is going to change in the age of AI, but security researchers just get screwed so hard on the bounty. Like if you've been in the game for a while, you kind of remember Eva, who did all the Firebase attacks and was able to compromise Cursor at one point, and I think she got like 10K at first, but then people were like, this is crazy. There was a ton of outrage, so she ended up getting like 50 to 100K, I believe, in bounties for figuring that specific one out. And like this is like private attachments, you know, who knows like what kind of lawsuits would have came from it. I don't know if they would have been defensible or winnable, but they definitely would have came about. But you know, they only got $3,500 for this. And there's like a super old story as well. I think someone got like $10,000 from Facebook like in the late 20-teens or mid 20-teens when he was able to like change anyone's passwords. So it's just like so unreal how undervalued these security researchers are. This is why I wish I had a successful startup, because I feel like I would just pay these security researchers so much to just like figure these things out and like really build like strong systems like we talked about in the Vercel solution, which I'm sure they're going to do. That's why they're hiring like these really critical companies that I'm sure are charging a lot. But like independent security researchers are just so undervalued, and it's really unreal compared to like how much damage they can do when they figure out these vulnerabilities. Okay, and lastly, we have a tweet from Pieter Levels. We've been talking about him a lot, but just very interesting tweets coming out of him. So he said that this year he got 4 billion requests and 300 million visitors, or I guess in 2025 potentially, or that's over the last 12 months. And he, I don't know how his calculation happened exactly, but it does make a lot of sense. He says that would cost him 338,000 if he wasn't on a VPS like Brian Lovin below. I don't know who Brian Lovin is. Oh, Notion. And he said that would cost me $340,000 if I wasn't on a VPS, and instead he pays $3,000 a year, 115 times less, because he hosts his sites on his own VPS, and his VPS servers are way too big and usually only use 10% of their resources, so he could go even lower with $300 per year if he optimized. And then he says at the end, especially with AI these days, it's easier than ever to host your sites yourself and way cheaper, 100 to 1,000 times cheaper. So yeah, it's really interesting. It kind of speaks to the DHH story we covered a couple of days ago that got a lot of positive feedback, so I'm glad people got value from that. But you know, if you were to host this on Vercel, I think it's like, I forget the number, but you get like X million requests, I believe, per like $20. But I should check the numbers, but it's around there, right? It's like single to low double-digit dollars per million requests, right? So if you look at 4 billion requests, that's going to be, you know, 1,000 times that. So it would make sense that it would be in like 100 to 300K per year. But if you just have a VPS, like you're not paying per request, you know, you're paying for bandwidth. And that's where it's like, if you have a really quick request, same with Vercel, I guess you're paying for CPU time, but you know, you get like a fixed amount, and you don't really get that much from these AWS servers. Like we were talking about with the DHH thing, is like you still have to understand a lot of infrastructure and architecture to build on top of these like hyperscaler clouds, compared to like with a VPS, you pretty much still have to learn like a lot of the same things. You do lose some things, right? Like you lose the pre-built services, right? That AWS has, like SQS and S3 and all that, but you know, you have MinIO, you have like all these open source queuing systems, for example, that you could use as replacements. And it is very arguable that you could just host everything on a VPS, especially with AI. If you're really interested in learning about the infrastructure and architecture, you'll understand it deeper, you'll have more control, you'll be more portable. That's kind of like where Docker comes in as well. Is like, I don't know how much people are using Docker these days. DHH, like they released that Kamal thing with 37 signals, which is like a Kubernetes replacement. So it's like, you do still have to figure these things out, and you're going to run into issues, you know, like, but for example, like one of my projects, I do run on a VPS. I moved it from AWS to a VPS, and I think I like reduced the cost by tenfold. So it was about $200 per month on AWS. And a lot of that was like the NAT gateway as well, which is like a whole scam in itself, and bandwidth, etc. you have to pay for. But now it's on like a $20 to $40 VPS that has like my database, my server, and my client. So it's also like isolation migration kind of becomes a problem as well. But it's like if your database is down, it doesn't really matter if your web and your API is working, or like if your API is working, it doesn't really matter if your web and your database is up, in my opinion. So very interesting. I'm sure like a lot of people are already caught on to this, and a lot of people are hosting on VPSs and moving away from like the Vercels. On the security front, though, I do agree with like what people were saying about the Vercel breach earlier today, which is that like, if you're on a VPS, you might not even know if you've been breached. So you would have to build systems for that, like activity logging based on like your ports and making sure your ports are secure and all that. But nonetheless, you do like have a lot more control, and you do have reasons to move off, as opposed to like the vendor lock that AWS and Vercel do trying to build in. But also with the Next.js like adapters that they've built, it does make it easier to host them anywhere. So I think we're moving in a really great direction with all of these tools, and everyone's trying to make things more open source just because of the competitive landscape. Like you kind of have to be competitive, because someone else is just going to build an open source version if you don't, or they're going to make it easier to migrate, and people really value those things. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to see a case study here from Levels like we had from DHH earlier.
This kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the Audionato Discord in the description. Thanks.